January 12, 1888, began as a cruel trick of the atmosphere. Across the Great Plains, from the Dakota Territory down through the Nebraska Sandhills and into western Kansas, the morning was unseasonably, almost suspiciously mild. After weeks of punishing cold, the sun emerged, and the air softened to a degree that felt like a reprieve, a false promise of an early spring. Men left their heavy coats on pegs by the door. Children, eager for the rare warmth, walked to their one-room schoolhouses wearing only light shawls and thin wool sweaters. Farmers ventured far into their sections to check on livestock, distance no longer feeling like a danger. In the small, square frame houses that dotted the treeless horizon, the morning fires were allowed to die down to a simmer. There was a sense of collective relief, a momentary exhaling of a frontier that had been held in the grip of a brutal winter. Then, the sky changed. It wasn't a gradual darkening, it was a structural collapse of the horizon. A wall of white and gray, described by survivors as a rolling, turbulent mountain of ice, obliterated the sun in seconds. Within minutes, the temperature did not just fall. It plummeted, dropping 40 degrees in less than 2 hours. The wind rose to a 60-mile-per-hour scream, carrying with it a snow so fine and dry it acted more like a liquid, penetrating the smallest gaps in windows and floorboards. Now, picture this. A mother standing at her kitchen table, watching as the moisture from her own breath freezes into a physical curtain of frost on the interior wall, while the tea in her cup turns to slush before she can take a sip. This was the Great Blizzard of 1888, better known as the Schoolchildren's Blizzard. It would claim hundreds of lives, many of them children caught in the few hundred yards between their schoolhouse and their homes. But as the bodies were recovered from the drifts in the following days, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The victims weren't just those caught out in the open. Many froze to death inside their own homes, the very structures that were supposed to represent their triumph over the wild. They died in houses built of imported pine and expensive glass, while just a few miles away, families living in what the social elite called dirt holes were sitting in their shirt sleeves, eating hot soup. Here's what everyone missed. The very architecture that proved you were a success in the eyes of the government was actually a death warrant signed in wood. The tragedy of 1888 was not just a meteorological event. It was a forensic failure of Victorian ego. To understand why the civilized died while the primitive survived, we have to look at the intersection of the Homestead Act of 1862 and the lethal physics of the High Plains. Under the Homestead Act, the United States government offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen who could prove up the claim. To gain the deed, you had to build a permanent dwelling, typically a structure no smaller than 12 by 14 feet, and live there for 5 years. But the government, in its infinite bureaucratic distance, didn't just want you to build a shelter. They wanted you to build progress. Progress, in the late 19th century, had a very specific look. It looked like the homes of the East Coast. It looked like the clapboard houses of New England, or the timber-frame cottages of the Ohio River Valley. It was square. It was upright. It was made of wood. To the settlers arriving from Norway, Germany, or the American East, a proper house was a symbol of their humanity. Living in the earth was something the Mandan, the Pawnee, and the Hidatsa did. And to the settlers' mind, that was a state of existence. They were trying to elevate themselves above. There was a profound social stigma attached to the soddy or the earth lodge. If you lived in the dirt, you were viewed as a failure, a person who had gone native or lacked the industry to build a real home. Think about that for a second. Thousands of families spent their life savings to ship pre-cut pine boards hundreds of miles by rail and then by wagon across a treeless ocean of grass, all to build a structure that was fundamentally allergic to the environment it sat in. These frame houses were balloon frames, a then-revolutionary construction method, using thin 2x4 studs, held together by nails rather than heavy timber joinery. While efficient and modern, these houses were essentially hollow boxes. They had zero thermal mass. They were designed for a climate where the wind was broken by forests and hills, not for the high plains, where a northern wind can gain momentum for 1,000 miles without hitting a single obstacle. In the 1880s, the high plains functioned as a thermal laboratory of the most brutal order. A frame house built on the Nebraska Prairie was a thermodynamic disaster. The thin pine siding, perhaps 3/4 of an inch thick, offered an R value of less than 1. Even with a layer of building paper and interior lath and plaster, the total thermal resistance of the wall rarely exceeded an R value of 3 or 4. For comparison, a modern insulated home aims for an R value of 20 or higher in the walls. But the lack of insulation wasn't the only killer. It was the wind-chill stripping effect. When a 60-mile-per-hour wind hits a square, sharp-edged structure, it creates zones of immense pressure and suction. On the windward side, the cold air is forced into every micro-fissure of the wood. On the leeward side, the vacuum created by the wind's path literally sucks the warm air out of the house. This is known as convective cooling, and in 1888, it turned frame houses into wind tunnels. A pot-bellied stove, fueled by expensive coal or scarce wood, might be glowing cherry red, but its heat was being stripped away faster than it could radiate. Families would huddle so close to the stove that their clothing would scorch, yet the water in a bucket 5 feet away would remain a solid block of ice. The numbers don't lie. To maintain a temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside a standard 1880s frame house, when the outside temperature is -30 with a high wind, you would need to burn through roughly 4 bushels of coal every 24 hours. For a homesteader, that was a fortune. Most couldn't afford it. They burned buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted slough grass, fuels that burned hot and fast but required constant feeding. When the blizzard hit and the white wall made it impossible to walk the 10 feet to the fuel haystack, the fire died. And when the fire died, the frame house became a wooden coffin in less than an hour. The settlers called the blizzard a white hurricane. It was a phenomenon of fluid dynamics. Because the Great Plains are so flat, the wind doesn't just blow, it laminates. It moves in layers of terrifying velocity. When this wind encountered a standard square house, the sharp corners created massive turbulence. The roof, usually pitched at a steep angle to shed rain that rarely came, acted like an airplane wing. The low pressure created over the leeward slope of the roof would literally try to lift the house off its foundation. Many of the deaths in 1888 occurred when the civilized houses simply disintegrated, the nails pulling free as the structure groaned under the sheer lift of the storm. Let that sink in. The very shape of the house, intended to show the neighbor that you were a man of means, was the very shape that the wind was designed to destroy. But beneath the screaming wind, there was another way of living that the settlers looked upon with civilized contempt. The indigenous tribes of the plains, the Mandan, the Pawnee, the Arikara, had solved this engineering problem 1,000 years earlier. They didn't fight the wind, they invited it to flow over them. They didn't fight the cold. They moved inside the thermal battery of the earth itself. They built earth lodges. To the European eye, the earth lodge looked like a mound of dirt, a primitive subterranean hovel. But in reality, it was a masterpiece of passive survivability. While the civilized frame house was fighting a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics, the earth lodge was utilizing them. The design was semi-subterranean, meaning the floor was excavated 3 to 4 feet below the surface. This wasn't just to get out of the wind, it was to reach the frost line. In the Dakotas, the frost line, the depth to which the ground freezes in winter, can reach 4 to 6 feet down. Below that line, the Earth maintains a constant temperature of roughly 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. By sinking the living space into the ground, the indigenous engineers were effectively anchoring their home to a massive, stable heat source. The earth lodge didn't start at -40 degrees like the frame house did. It started at 50 degrees. Even without a fire, an earth lodge would never drop to a temperature that would kill a human being. It was, by definition, a life support system. The engineering of the lodge was a testament to communal wisdom. It began with the 4-post trinity, 4 massive central timbers, usually cottonwood or cedar, sunk deep into the floor to form a square. These posts were the spine of the structure, designed to carry a dead load that would crush a frame house. On top of this central square, a complex web of rafters and willow lathing was woven, creating a dome shape. This dome was then covered in a thick layer of prairie grass, followed by a foot or more of dense, packed sod. The result was a structure that weighed several tons, yet was flexible. But the genius was in the laminar flow. Because the lodge was a curved mound, the 60-mile-per-hour winds of the blizzard didn't hit it like a wall. The wind followed the curve of the dome, laminating over the surface and actually pressing the structure more firmly into the ground. There were no suction zones to rip the roof off. There were no pressure zones to force cold air through the cracks. The wind simply ignored the lodge. Inside, the silence was absolute. While the settlers in their frame houses were deafened by the roar of the wind vibrating the thin pine walls, those in the earth lodges heard nothing but the muffled thump of the storm. The earth is an incredible acoustic and thermal insulator. A 3-foot-thick wall of sod provides an effective R value of roughly 9, but more importantly, it provides thermal lag. It takes hours, sometimes days, for a change in exterior temperature to migrate through 3 feet of earth. The blizzard of 1888 lasted roughly 24 hours, not nearly long enough to penetrate the thermal mass of a well-built lodge. As the sun went down on that terrifying Thursday in January, the contrast was total. In the frame houses, the panic was set in. Mothers were tearing up floorboards to feed the stove. They were huddling under every blanket they owned, yet they could feel the heat being stripped from their bodies by the invisible fingers of the wind. They were living in a thermal sieve. Every BTU of heat generated by their fire was being lost to the atmosphere in a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, in the few soddies and earth lodges that existed on the periphery, the situation was almost mundane. A small fire of buffalo chips in the central hearth was more than enough to bring the interior temperature up to a comfortable 65 degrees. The earth walls, having absorbed the heat of the fire all day, acted as a heat battery, radiating warmth back into the room long after the flames died down. The families inside were safe, not because they were hardier or more used to the cold, but because they were living in a structure that respected the physics of the Great Plains. The tragedy of the Schoolchildren's blizzard was a tragedy of pride. The settlers chose the frame house because it was the architecture of the conqueror. They wanted to prove that they could bring the East to the West, that they could impose their square, wooden world onto the round, earthen reality of the prairie. But the prairie is not a place that accepts imposition. It is a place that demands adaptation. The numbers don't lie. Hundreds died for the sake of an aesthetic. They died because they were told that living in a proper house was the mark of a civilized man, and they believed it, even as the thermometer retreated into the bulb and the wind began to lift the very roof over their heads. To build an earth lodge was not merely to dig a hole, it was to perform a forensic intervention into the very skin of the planet. A deliberate, calculated move to escape the chaotic fluctuations of the atmosphere and enter the steady, rhythmic pulse of the geology beneath. While the European settler arrived with a wagon full of thin, kyaline-dried pine wood that had been severed from its roots and stripped of its life, the indigenous architect began by looking at the ground not as an obstacle to be plowed, but as the primary building material of a fortress. The construction of a proper lodge, like those seen among the Mandan or the Pawnee, began with the most critical engineering decision of all: the excavation. This was not a shallow scraping of the surface. The builders would mark out a perfect circle, often 30 to 40 feet in diameter, and begin the grueling process of removing several thousand cubic feet of soil. Now, picture this. A group of workers using nothing but sharpened shoulder blades of elk or bison, and later, the heavy iron spades of the trade era, to descend 3, 4, or even 5 feet into the hard-packed prairie. They were digging toward a specific thermal destination, the frost line. In the harsh geography of the Dakotas and Nebraska, the winter frost can penetrate the earth to a depth of 4 or even 6 feet, turning the upper layers of soil into a frozen, brittle crust that offers no warmth. But below that line, below the reach of the biting northern winds, the earth maintains a constant, unwavering temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. By sinking the floor of the lodge into this subterranean stratum, the builders were essentially plugging into a planetary radiator. Here's what everyone missed. While the settler's frame house started its thermal battle at whatever temperature the air happened to be, often 20 or 30 degrees below zero, the earth lodge began its day at a stable 50 degrees. It was a head start that no amount of burning coal could ever replicate in a wooden shack. Once the floor was leveled and the central fire pit was carved into the middle, the engineering shifted from excavation to structural load-bearing. This was the stage of the four-post trinity. In a treeless ocean of grass, finding the right timber was a quest that could take weeks. The builders searched the river bottoms for cottonwood, or, if they were lucky, red cedar trees that had survived the floods and the fires. They needed 4 massive trunks, 12 to 15 inches in diameter, each one a solid column of ancient carbon. These 4 posts were the heart of the lodge. They were positioned in a square around the central hearth, sunk deep into the floor, and braced with crossbeams of equal thickness. Think about that for a second. These 4 timbers weren't just holding up a roof. They were designed to carry a dead load of nearly 200 pounds per square foot. In a modern suburban home, a roof is lucky if it's rated for 40 pounds. But the earth lodge was different. It had to support not just its own massive weight, but the weight of 3 feet of soil and the inevitable 10-foot snowdrifts of a Great Plains winter. If those 4 central posts failed, the results would be measured in tons of collapsing earth. Outside this central square, a second, larger circle of shorter posts was driven into the ground, usually standing about 5 feet high. This created the outer wall. Connecting the tops of these outer posts to the central 4-post trinity were the rafters' long, tapering poles of willow or ash. These rafters were the ribs of the structure. They weren't nailed in place. They were lashed with rawhide or woven into the structure, allowing for a degree of flexibility that a rigid, nailed frame could never achieve. This was kinetic engineering. When the winds of a blizzard hit the lodge, the structure didn't snap or crack. It groaned and shifted, the rawhide ties tightening as the wood moved, distributing the stress across the entire dome rather than concentrating it at a single weak point. On top of these rafters came the muscularity of the roof, the willow lathing. Thousands of thin willow saplings were woven horizontally across the rafters, creating a dense, thatched mat. This wasn't just for decoration. The willow weave functioned as a structural membrane, a flexible skeleton that could support the immense pressure of the earth that was about to be laid on top. The scent inside the lodge at this stage would be overwhelming: the smell of freshly cut willow, the dampness of the excavated soil, and the resinous tang of the cedar posts. It was the smell of a forest being reconstructed underground. But it is the final 2 layers of the lodge that provided the invisible protection that saved lives in 1888. First, the builders covered the willow lathing with a thick carpet of dried prairie grass, specifically the big bluestem or little bluestem that grew in abundance. This grass layer acted as a vapor barrier and a drainage mat. If any moisture managed to penetrate the outer shell, the grass would wick it away, directing it down the slope of the dome and into the surrounding soil, keeping the interior dry and preventing the timbers from rotting. Then came the capping. This was the most labor-intensive and critical phase. The builders would return to the prairie and cut sod bricks. These weren't just chunks of dirt. They were sections of the living prairie, 6 inches thick and 12 inches wide, held together by a dense, chaotic web of roots that had been growing for decades. These roots were the rebar of the frontier. When these sod bricks were laid over the grass layer, they were placed like shingles, overlapping to ensure there were no gaps. Let that sink in. A finished earth lodge was covered in nearly 18 inches to 3 feet of solid, root-reinforced earth. The total weight of the roof alone could exceed 20 tons. To the uneducated eye, it looked like a burial mound. But to the physicist, it was a masterpiece of thermal mass. Soil density is roughly 100 pounds per cubic foot. When you surround a living space with 3 feet of that material, you aren't just insulating it. You are creating a thermal battery. During the day, the heat from the central fire would rise and be absorbed by the earth walls and the ceiling. Because the soil is so dense, it doesn't just let the heat pass through, it captures it. This is the thermal lag phenomenon. It takes a significant amount of energy to change the temperature of several tons of earth. While the temperature outside might swing 60 degrees in a single day, the interior of the lodge would remain nearly constant. The heat absorbed by the walls during the day would be slowly radiated back into the room during the night, a gentle infrared warmth that didn't rely on the flickering flames of a dying fire. Now, consider the geometry of this structure. Unlike the civilized frame house with its sharp corners and vertical walls, the Earth Lodge was a parabolic dome. This is where the laminar flow narrative truly comes into play. When the 60-mile-per-hour winds of the blizzard hit a square house, they create a stagnation point on the windward side, a zone of high pressure that forces cold air into every crack and crevice. At the same time, the wind creates a vacuum on the leeward side, literally sucking the warm air out of the building. But the Earth Lodge was invisible to the wind. Because it was a low-profile dome, the wind didn't hit it. The wind flowed over it. The air was forced to follow the curve of the structure, staying in a state of laminar flow where the layers of wind stayed parallel to the surface. Instead of trying to lift the roof off, the wind actually pressed the lodge more firmly into the ground. The higher the wind speed, the more the structure was stabilized. The numbers don't lie. The aerodynamic drag of an Earth Lodge was less than one-third that of a standard frame house. The blizzard wasn't a threat to the lodge, it was just a passing current in a fluid atmosphere. Inside the lodge, the sensory experience was the polar opposite of the terror outside. While the settlers in their wooden houses were listening to the scream of the wind and the rattling of the pine boards, the inhabitants of the Earth Lodge were surrounded by a silence so profound it was almost tactile. The 3 feet of earth functioned as a perfect acoustic insulator, dampening the roar of the white hurricane to a distant, muffled hum. In the center of the lodge, the fire burned with a steady, quiet flame. But here is the most sophisticated engineering detail of all: the Venturi effect smoke hole. At the very peak of the dome, the builders left a circular opening, roughly 3 feet across. This served as both a window and a chimney. In the middle of a blizzard, you might think this hole would allow the cold air to pour in, but the laws of physics dictated otherwise. As the wind accelerated over the curve of the dome, it created a zone of low pressure directly over the smoke hole. This low pressure acted as a suction pump, drawing the smoke up and out of the lodge with incredible efficiency. However, this created a dangerous YMYL safety problem. If you are sucking air out, where is the fresh air coming from? If the main door, a long tunnel-like entrance designed to trap cold air, was sealed by a 10-foot snowdrift, the fire would quickly consume all the oxygen in the room. This is the oxygen starvation trap that killed many inexperienced settlers who tried to build soddies without understanding indigenous design. The master builders of the lodge solved this with a dedicated low-level air intake. Often, they would construct a secondary tunnel or use the main entrance's floor-level gaps to create a current of fresh air that was pre-warmed by the ground before it reached the fire. This ensured that even when the entire world was buried in snow, the lodge could breathe. It was a closed-loop life support system, powered by the earth and governed by the laws of fluid dynamics. As the blizzard of 1888 reached its peak, the civilized world was breaking apart. The frame houses were vibrating, their nails pulling free, their occupants shivering in a space that was losing heat at a rate of thousands of British thermal units per hour. But inside the Earth Lodge, the thermal mass was holding steady. The families were sitting on woven mats on the floor, the earth beneath them radiating the 50-degree warmth of the deep planet. They weren't fighting the blizzard, they were simply waiting it out, cocooned in an engineering marvel that had been perfected over 1,000 years. The contrast was not one of wealth or poverty, it was a contrast of alignment. The settler had spent his energy trying to impose a European shape on a landscape that rejected it. The indigenous builder had spent his energy aligning himself with the physical realities of the high plains. One structure was a monument to the ego of the conqueror, and it failed. The other was a monument to the wisdom of the inhabitant, and it stood silent, warm, and unshaken, while the world above it turned into a white, frozen hell. Think about the physical weight of that wisdom. Every pound of dirt on that roof, every willow sapling in that weave, every cottonwood post in that trinity, was a calculated response to the environment. The Earth Lodge wasn't primitive. It was a high-performance, semi-subterranean survival module that utilized the R value of the grass, the thermal mass of the soil, the aerodynamic efficiency of the dome, and the constant temperature of the frost line. In the forensic audit of 1888, the Earth Lodge proved that the most advanced technology is not always the newest. It is the one that most closely obeys the laws of the world it inhabits. To understand why the Earth Lodge was a sanctuary, while the frame house was a death trap, we must look into the invisible, silent mechanics of thermal mass, a concept that the 19th century homesteader ignored at their own peril. Most people think of insulation in terms of R value, the resistance to heat flow, but R value is only one half of the survival equation. The other half, the one that governs life and death in a sub-zero gale, is thermal lag. Now, picture this. A standard pine board used in a frame house has a density of roughly 35 pounds per cubic foot. It is thin, porous, and offers almost no ability to store energy. When the fire in a pot-bellied stove goes out, the heat inside a wooden house vanishes almost instantly, sucked through the walls by the ravenous cold. But the Earth Lodge was encased in a shell of soil with a density of at least 100 pounds per cubic foot. This wasn't just a wall. It was a heat battery. In physics, this is known as high volumetric heat capacity. As the central fire burned throughout the day, the 3-foot-thick walls of the lodge were absorbing trillions of vibrating molecules of thermal energy. Because the Earth is so massive, it takes a staggering amount of energy to change its temperature. This creates a lag of 8 to 12 hours. By the time the bitterest chill of the midnight prairie tried to work its way through the exterior of the lodge, the heat from the afternoon fire was just beginning to migrate outward from the interior. The two forces met in the middle of the sod, neutralizing each other. The result was an interior climate that remained eerily, almost miraculously stable, regardless of the violence of the sky. But this thermal sanctuary came with a hidden, lethal price that every builder had to navigate: the invisible killer. When you seal yourself inside a semi-subterranean dome to escape the wind, you are also sealing yourself into a closed-loop atmospheric system. In 1888, many settlers who tried to mimic the Saudi design without understanding the underlying physics died before the blizzard even reached its peak. They didn't die of cold. They died of carbon monoxide poisoning. To keep a fire going in an enclosed space, you need two things: a way for the toxic exhaust to leave and a way for fresh oxygen to enter. The engineering of the exhaust system was a matter of life and death. The central smoke hole of an earth lodge had to be designed with a clearance to combustibles of at least 18 inches, meaning no wooden rafters or willow lathing could come within that distance of the rising heat column. If the wood dried out too much from the fire, the entire roof, 20 tons of earth and timber, could turn into a massive smoldering oven. But the real danger was the chimney freeze. During a Great Plains blizzard, snow doesn't just fall. It drifts in mountainous waves that can reach heights of 10, 15, or even 20 feet. If a snowdrift covered the smoke hole, the carbon monoxide would have nowhere to go. It would backdraft into the living space, a silent, odorless gas that would put a family to sleep in minutes, never to wake up. The Indigenous architects solved this with a masterstroke of Venturi physics. By extending the chimney structure, or utilizing the natural low-pressure zone at the apex of the dome, they ensured that the 60-mile-per-hour winds actually helped the house breathe. As the wind whipped over the top of the lodge, it created a vacuum, a suction force that literally pulled the smoke out of the hole, even against the weight of the falling snow. But you cannot suck air out of a bottle without letting more air in. This was the purpose of the low-level intake. Many lodges utilized a secondary tunnel or a specific gap in the entryway that allowed fresh, oxygen-rich air to enter at floor level. As this cold air traveled through the entryway, it was preheated by the earth before it reached the central fire. It was a primitive but perfect heat exchange system. If you blocked that intake to keep the cold out, you were effectively suffocating yourself. The settlers who survived were the ones who understood that a house must breathe as surely as a human does. The numbers don't lie. The physics of 1888 were stacked against the civilized. A frame house during the blizzard was a thermal sieve. At minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, with a 60-mile-per-hour wind, a wooden house loses heat through its walls at a rate of roughly 50 British thermal units per square foot per hour. In a standard 12 by 14-foot homestead shack, that amounts to a total heat loss of over 10,000 units every 60 minutes. To counter that, you would have to run a coal stove at its absolute physical limit, consuming nearly 100 pounds of fuel a day. But in an earth lodge, because the wind is laminating over the curved surface and the earth provides a 3-foot buffer, the heat loss drops to less than 5 units per square foot. It is a 10-fold increase in efficiency. You could maintain a 70-degree interior with nothing more than a handful of dried buffalo chips and a small, steady flame. Then came the moment of truth. January 12, 1888, approximately 12 noon. In the schoolhouses and the frame homes, the first sign wasn't the snow, it was the sound. Survivors described a roar like 1,000 freight trains crossing the prairie at once. The white wall hit with such velocity that it didn't just obscure the sun, it erased the very concept of direction. In under 120 seconds, the temperature across the Nebraska sandhills dropped 40 degrees. This was the flash freeze. Moisture in the air turned instantly into ice crystals, so fine they felt like powdered glass. Inside the frame houses, the panic was immediate. The wind began to strip the heat from the pine siding. Within 20 minutes, the interior walls, the very wood the families were leaning against for warmth, began to grow a thick, white beard of frost. This is the phase change of survival. When the wall of your home reaches the freezing point, the moisture in your breath no longer stays a gas. It crystallizes on the surface. Now, picture this. A family of 5 huddled in the center of a room, watching as the frost line advances across their floorboards, moving inch by inch toward the stove. They are burning their furniture, their books, their very floorboards, but it is not enough. The wind is moving 60 miles per hour, and it is scouring the house. Every time the wind hits a corner, it creates turbulence that pulls more heat away. The convective cooling is so aggressive that even if the stove is glowing red, the air 3 feet away is 0 degrees. Outside, the situation was a nightmare of fluid dynamics. The snow was so dense and moving so fast that it created static discharge. The air glowed with a ghostly blue electricity as the ice crystals rubbed against each other at high velocity. Children who had been let out of school early, thinking they could make it the 200 yards to their front door, found themselves blinded by the white. In a blizzard of this magnitude, your inner ear fails. Without a horizon, you lose the ability to walk in a straight line. Many victims were found just 10 feet from their own front doors, having walked in circles until their core body temperature dropped below 88 degrees, triggering the final, lethargic cold sleep of hypothermia. But inside the Earth Lodge, the world was different. As the freight train roar passed over the dome, the inhabitants felt nothing. Perhaps a slight vibration in the central cottonwood posts, the 4-post trinity groaning under the sudden atmospheric pressure, but the air remained still. The thermal lag was their shield. While the frame house was fighting a battle of minutes, the Earth Lodge was operating on a timeline of days. The 3 feet of sod was a massive dam against the flood of cold. The families in the lodges weren't tearing up their floorboards. They were sitting in the dim, golden light of their central fire, listening to the muffled, subterranean thrum of the storm. Think about that for a second. While the civilized world was literally disintegrating nails, popping out of pine boards as the wood contracted in the cold, roofs lifting like wings as the vacuum of the wind tried to tear them off the primitive Earth Lodge, was becoming more stable. The weight of the falling snow, which reached 20 pounds per cubic foot as it packed down, was actually adding to the dead load of the lodge, pressing the sod bricks tighter together, sealing the microscopic gaps, and increasing the total thermal mass. The storm was not a destroyer of the lodge, it was its final layer of insulation. By 2 p.m., the blizzard had reached its peak. The frost line in the ground was being pushed deeper by the relentless cold, but it could not reach the floor of the lodge, which sat 4 feet below the surface. The inhabitants were literally below the storm. They were living in a geological timescale, where the temperature is governed by the core of the planet rather than the whims of the Arctic. They were eating hot meals of dried meat and corn, while 3 miles away, a schoolteacher was huddling her students together in a wooden shack that was vibrating so violently the windows were shattering in their frames. The tragedy of 1888 was a forensic demonstration of the price of pride. The frame house was an architectural lie. It was a structure that pretended the Great Plains were the same as the forests of Germany or the hills of Vermont. It was a house built for an average day. But the Great Plains do not deal in averages. They deal in extremes. The Earth Lodge was built for the maximum event. It was designed for the 1 hour in the 1 day every 50 years, when nature decides to kill everything that is not anchored to the earth. As the sun set on that frozen Thursday, the heat battery of the Earth Lodge was still discharging its stored warmth. The families inside were safe, their oxygen levels maintained by the Venturi smoke hole, their bodies protected by the massive volumetric heat capacity of the soil. They were the uncivilized survivors of a civilized catastrophe. Let that sink in. The very dirt the settlers had spent their lives trying to overcome was the only thing that could have saved them. The forensic data of the Schoolchildren's blizzard proves that in the battle between progress and physics, the Earth always has the final word. While the wooden boxes of the homesteaders were being turned into splintered tombs, the mounds of the prairie remained silent, warm, and utterly indifferent to the screaming wind. The engineering wasn't just in the wood and the dirt. It was in the thermal audit of human life. Every BTU of energy saved by the lodge's dome shape was a second of life bought for its inhabitants. Every inch of sod was a barrier against the wind-chill stripping that was turning human breath into ice. In 1888, the High Plains became a laboratory of the most brutal sort, and the Earth Lodge was the only structure that passed the test. It wasn't just a house. It was a laminar flow machine, a thermal capacitor, and a subterranean lifeboat, all hidden beneath a simple layer of prairie grass. To truly grasp the magnitude of this architectural divergence, we have to look at the raw data, the cold, forensic reality of the thermal audit. The numbers don't lie, and in the winter of 1888, they told a story of two entirely different physical universes existing on the same patch of frozen prairie. If you were to look at a standard 12 by 14-foot frame house through a modern infrared lens during that blizzard, you would see a structure that was essentially hemorrhaging its soul into the atmosphere. The heat wasn't just escaping, it was being stripped away at a rate that defied the physics of survival. In a frame house, the primary enemy was the convective heat transfer coefficient. Because the pine boards were less than an inch thick, and the balloon frame construction left large hollow cavities between the studs, the house functioned as a series of vertical wind tunnels. As the 60-mile-per-hour wind slammed into the windward side, it created a high-pressure zone that forced sub-zero air into every microscopic gap in the joinery. On the opposite side, a low-pressure vacuum was pulling the warm air out through the leeward walls. This is what engineers call wind wash, a process where the moving air destroys the insulating value of the structure by constantly replacing the warmed air inside the walls with the freezing air from the outside. To maintain an interior temperature of just 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature where you are still shivering but your heart hasn't yet begun to fail, that wooden shack required a staggering 12,000 British thermal units of heat energy every single hour. To produce that much heat using the standard fuel of the plains, a family would have to burn through nearly 4 bushels of coal every 24 hours. For a homesteader, 4 bushels of coal represented a week's wages and a day's worth of back-breaking hauling. Most families simply didn't have it. They were forced to rely on buffalo chips or twisted hay, fuels that provided high heat for a few minutes before collapsing into ash. The moment the fire flickered, the interior temperature would drop by 1 degree every 3 minutes. In less than 2 hours after the fire went out, the inside of a civilized home was exactly the same temperature as the Arctic hell outside. Now, picture this. Just a few hundred yards away, the Earth Lodge was performing a completely different set of thermodynamic calculations. Because the lodge was semi-subterranean, its exposed surface area was significantly lower than the frame house. But more importantly, the dome shape and the thick layer of sod created a boundary layer that the wind simply could not penetrate. The laminar flow we discussed earlier meant that the 60-mile-per-hour wind was not stripping heat, it was gliding over the surface. The convective heat loss of an earth lodge was 70% lower than that of a square building. Inside that 3-foot-thick shell of earth, the thermal audit reveals the power of the heat battery. The soil density, nearly 100 pounds per cubic foot, acted as a massive capacitor for infrared energy. While the frame house was a sieve, the lodge was a vault. The forensic data shows that an earth lodge required only 1,500 British thermal units per hour to maintain a comfortable 65 degrees. That is a fuel requirement nearly 8 times smaller than the wooden shack. A family in an earth lodge could survive the entire 3-day duration of a Great Plains blizzard on less than half a bushel of fuel. They weren't just warmer. They were operating with a level of efficiency that made them nearly immune to the supply chain failures of the frontier. Think about that for a second. The settler in the frame house was working 10 times harder, spending 10 times more money on fuel, and taking 10 times the risk, all to live in a structure that was fundamentally trying to kill him. We often think of progress as a steady climb toward better technology, but the thermal audit of 1888 proves that sometimes progress is actually a form of collective amnesia. We forgot how to listen to the earth, and we paid for that forgetfulness with the lives of our children. The tragedy of the Schoolchildren's blizzard was not just a failure of meteorology, it was a failure of the Victorian ego. The settlers didn't die because they lacked the technology to survive. They died because they were too proud to use the technology that was already there. To the 19th century mind, the soddy and the earth lodge were symbols of failure. They were the homes of the savage and the destitute. Social status in the 1880s was measured in pine boards and glass windows. A man would rather watch his children shiver in a proper house than see them thrive in a dirt hole. It was a lethal form of architectural vanity, the belief that civilization is defined by how much of the natural world you can exclude, rather than how well you can integrate with it. But the earth does not care about social status. The physics of the high plains do not respect the civilized aesthetic of a New England clapboard house. The prairie only respects the circle, the dome, and the deep, insulating weight of the soil. The settlers who survived and the indigenous peoples who had thrived on this land for 1,000 years before them understood that survival is not a battle against nature, it is a negotiation with it. They realized that the earth was not just something to be plowed and conquered, but something to be entered. As we look back at the wreckage of 1888, there is a profound lesson for our own modern world. We still build our homes as if we are trying to insulate ourselves from the planet itself. We rely on complex, fragile grids of electricity and gas to keep our square, thin-walled boxes habitable. But if the grid went down today, if the flow of external energy was severed, how many of our modern palaces would become wooden coffins in a matter of hours? Let that sink in. We are still living in the mortality of pine, just with better siding and more expensive windows. History isn't just a record of what happened. It's a manual for what we might have to do again. But before you pick up a shovel, you must remember the hard lessons of the forensic record. Building into the earth is an act of high engineering, not a weekend hobby. You must account for the dead load of the soil. A roof that can weigh 20 tons requires a structural trinity of timbers that most modern builders couldn't even source. You must respect the invisible killer, designing a ventilation system that utilizes the Venturi effect to keep the air moving, even when the world is buried under 10 feet of snow. Without a dedicated low-level air intake and a properly offset chimney, an earth lodge isn't a sanctuary. It's a gas chamber. The wisdom of the earth lodge is the wisdom of place. It is the realization that the best way to survive a storm is to become part of the landscape that the storm is passing over. The Mandan, the Pawnee, and the few settlers who were humble enough to follow their lead survived because they stopped trying to stand above the prairie and started living within it. They traded the pride of the porch for the silence of the soil. Next time you look at a rolling hill or a stretch of untouched prairie, don't just see empty space. See the thermal battery that lies beneath your feet. See the laminar flow of the wind that wants to move over you, not through you. The great blizzard will come again in one form or another, and when it does, the survivors won't be the ones with the most civilized houses. They will be the ones who remember that the earth has been keeping us warm since the beginning of time. If only we are humble enough to ask for its protection. If this journey into the forensic engineering of the frontier has changed the way you look at your own four walls, consider subscribing to the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the lost physics of history, the survival secrets that our ancestors knew by heart, but that we have traded for the illusions of modern progress. Stay curious, stay humble, and remember, the most advanced technology you will ever own is the ground you're standing on.